Hi, and this is Dr. Nadia Fuladian. I want to explain to you a little bit about some parts of the brain blood vessels that is the dural sinuses. So here you see one simple version of the dural sinuses. You see the parts of the dura. This is falx cerebri, and then you have falx cerebelli, and in the middle you have tentorium cerebelli here, right? So you see that the two ends of the falx cerebri, you have one sinus on the top that is the superior sagittal sinus, because these are in the sagittal plane. Then here on the lower border you have inferior sagittal sinus. Then you see that along the tentorium cerebelli you have this line that connects these two to each other as the straight sinus. So just generally all these sinuses are bringing back all the venous vein toward the outside of the brain, right? You have here, you see that have been shown that just the entrance of the great cerebral vein sorry, that they are bringing back the other of the venous vein from all around the brain alongside of the cerebral arteries, right? They're bringing back the blood toward these sinuses to help them to get out of the brain to go toward the heart, right? So you have these three, these are the base part, and then we are going to continue to see all the other parts. So far you have the superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, and straight sinus. Now, in this place that you see, you have confluences of sinuses. It means that this superior sagittal sinus that comes from the up on the lower part continues with the occipital sinus. So this occipital sinus, as you see, it goes down here and continues in the behind the occipital lobe of the brain here. On the two sides, you have two sinuses that going on this side. Therefore, as they are crossing on the side, transversing, we call it transverse sinus. So you have one on that side, the other one on this side that you don't see now, the other side of that. And besides this straight sinus that coming from anterior joining that one, all these five sinuses actually they are connecting here, that if you look from this posterior side you actually see a cross from superior sagittal, occipital sinus, and the two transverse sinus on the sides. That's the part that we call it confluences of sinuses. So this is the part that, as you see, it is making the posterior part of the dural sinuses. Now this transverse sinus, then it continues as this S shape that we call it sigmoid sinus. When it gets here, then it goes down toward the jugular foramen and then pass through that and become the internal jugular vein that goes down alongside the neck and then continues as the internal jugular vein to join the brachiocephalic vein, join the subclavian vein and become the brachiocephalic vein on each side, right? Here haven't been shown here. This one should have been continue as one vein and become internal jugular vein, just haven't been shown here. But in the next picture, we totally have the continuation of that becomes the internal jugular vein. So this is the posterior circulation. Now on the anterior that you have it here, you see here, you have the sella turcica, part of the sphenoid bone, and the hypophyseal fossa that the hypophyseal gland or pituitary gland is located into that. Around that you have the sinus and all the other part that we're going to see them all in the next pictures. So here you're looking from the back to the brain and these sinuses, and as you see you have these confluence of the sinuses here, superior sagittal sinus, occipital sinus, and the two transverse sinus here and a straight sinus here that you have here inferior sagittal sinus. Then you see the transverse sinus continues as sigmoid sinus, and then that's the one that goes inside and then get out of the skull through the jugular foramen to become internal jugular vein. Here you see the same thing, that it shows the brain and the falx cerebri and tentorium cerebelli. So that's a good view that shows that the actual position of the straight sinus, and then you see the positioning of the transverse sinuses, and then here occipital sinus continues, and here you would have the confluence of the sinuses. You see that this transverse sinus becomes sigmoid sinus and then continues to become the internal jugular vein here. This is also showing the positions of the falx cerebri, tentorium cerebelli here inside of the skull. Again, you see all the same structures, and you see the transverse sinus that here becomes the sigmoid sinus and then passing through the skull here, through the jugular vein. And now, again, another good view that you will see: superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, the two transverse sinus here. Occipital sinus haven't been shown here, just to simplify the picture here. Then you see the sigmoid sinus that on each side is then it passing through the jugular foramen, haven't been shown, then become internal jugular vein. Now, going over the anterior part here, this is the part that you have around the pituitary gland here. Then on the two sides, you have the other sinuses that we're going to see them, but here you see that how they are connecting. Finally, all of them, all the venous vein of the brain goes through the sigmoid sinus and internal jugular vein getting out of the brain here. So we talked about all these posterior part. Here you can just go and review all these ones. Now regarding the anterior part, we're gonna go over these once more and see them. So you see we have there around the, as we mentioned, we have around the, you see the better view here, around the pituitary gland, you have you have this sinus that you have around the pituitary gland, and we call it the cavernous sinus. Now, around the cavernous sinus, we have two petrosal sinus, superior petrosal sinus. This one it actually should be around this one completely. This is cavernous sinus, the whole thing that we have around, and then petrosal sinus. We have two superior petrosal and inferior petrosal. Finally, all of them get into the. This one goes straight to the sigmoid sinus. The other one goes to the jugular vein over there. All of these ones bringing all the venous vein around this area, and that's important because this pituitary gland is an important part of the endocrine system of the body, and any infection around here can spread around that specific area that you see. You have the optic nerves and other more important blood vessels and structures and part of the brain, everything deep into the brain. So that's very important that these veins that are also are coming from the vessels around the eye and can spread any infection that coming from all these areas inside of the brain. That shows it's significant. So anyhow, in this view, this is another good view that you see the straight sinus. Pay attention, this is the straight sinus. In some pictures by mistake they may have mentioned that as occipital sinus. As you see here, you have the membrane of the dura here, that is tentorium cerebelli, and you have the straight sinus here. If we remove this one and you have only the skull under that you will see in the next picture, that is the place that you will have you have the occipital sinus. So as you see here, the transverse sinuses and the straight sinus are all in the one level. Then transverse sinus, as you see, becomes this sigmoid sinus and then passes through the jugular foramen and gets out of the skull. In this view here, you see this part that now here tentorium cerebelli has been removed, and you see the bottom part of the skull that is occipital sinus. So this originally had been labeled in this picture that have been taken from the internet by mistake as the straight sinus, but it's actually the occipital sinus. And here you see the confluences of the sinuses that on the top of that has superior sagittal sinus. This is another view that's from Netter, that's always valuable, but just couldn't be taken well with the pictures, but still this picture is showing well the shape and the location of the sigmoid sinus and how it is continuing with the internal jugular vein. So I just wanted you to see that. And this is another one that also showing all these cavernous sinus that all around the pituitary gland. Then you have the petrosal ones and how they are connecting, like for example this occipital sinus, how finally connects to the sigmoid and internal jugular. So that was all about the sinuses. Now you see them over the models here. In this model, you see the superior sagittal sinus here, that you see that from the posterior view here. Now in these ones, from the posterior view, you see the transverse sinuses and superior sagittal sinus, and here is the confluences of the sinuses. I'm not sure that the occipital sinus have been shown here, but if there is anything, that would be the occipital sinus here. Now from the inside, one side of the model have been removed, and you see the superior sagittal sinus, confluence of the sinuses, and the two transverse sinus. Now you see this transverse sinus makes a sigmoid sinus that is going to get out of the brain through the jugular foramen and become the internal jugular vein here. And here the same. The other things that you see here, that is this straight sinus that you see on this one. If this is, I believe this is the straight one. So it is in the midline. If this is in the midline, this is the straight. This is another model. Again, you see the superior sagittal sinus on the top view. You see the posterior view, superior sagittal, and the two transverse sinus. And here you have the occipital sinus here too, within the confluence of the sinuses. And here you see the same model, how the transverse sinus here becomes the sigmoid sinus and how it gets out of the jugular foramen as the internal jugular vein. Here you see other Veseels arteries that are coming into the brain that we're going to cover in another video. Now inside of the skull, when you are looking in the same model, when we remove the brain and look in here, you see the superior sagittal sinus. We are looking from the top into the bottom of the skull here. You have the superior sagittal sinus here, the two transverse sinuses, and inferior and occipital sinus here, and this is the confluences of the sinuses. And again, transverse sinus becomes the sphenoid, becomes the sigmoid sinus, and then it gets out of the skull through the jugular foramen. And all these ones, the circle of the Willis and all those things have been mentioned in another video. That you see another view of the circle of the Willis, that only are the arteries, and we are going to review them later. So hopefully this one makes it very clear. As you see, that's not very difficult, just you need to follow them in different angles, because just the problem is that sometimes it's not visible in every angle. So I hope these pictures, that many of them have been taken from internet, make them very easy to follow. Have a great time.